I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to Trump Watch. One of the fascinating aspects of this U.S.-Israeli war on Iran has been this issue, obviously, of the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran has essentially put a blockade on ships going through that strait, which has caused enormous economic disruption all over the world, including here in the United States. But what I find fascinating about it is how the Trump administration and the U.S. national security establishment have flip-flopped in how they're viewing this particular blockade from the time that it first appeared and till where we are today. When the Iranians first started to do this, to impose this blockade, there was an immediate increase in the price of gasoline and oil all over the world, as everyone knows, including here in the United States. And the position of the Trump administration and the national security state was that they would let Iran let in as many ships in the strait as possible. They even lifted sanctions on Russia and on Iranian vessels that were traveling through the strait or on the high seas. And their rationale was that, look, the world needs as much oil coming through that strait as possible in order to keep the economic disruption to a minimal level. And so the price they're willing to pay for that is Iran, makes money on the oil sales that it is making, plus any tolls that it was charging. And Russia would benefit, but by the same token, there at least would be some quantity of additional oil that would be supplying the world. So there was a logic in that, in the sense that if you really believed that a total blockade of oil would be disastrous for the world, then it's logical that the position would be, well, let's let in as much as possible, supplying the rest of the world. That position flip-flopped at some point, where they decided to blockade the blockaders. The U.S. did. In other words, they imposed a blockade that would accomplish what Iran was trying to accomplish, except more completely. The attitude was that now we're going to change positions and we're going to block all oil from coming through the Strait of Hormuz, including the Iranian oil and any vessels containing oil that had paid a toll or that Iran was willing to let go through the strait. And the idea was that when we have to balance this out, additional oil for the world versus Iran benefiting from a certain quantity of oil coming into the world, we're going to choose no oil at all. Which I find fascinating in the sense that at first they said, we can't handle this kind of disruption. And they even to the point where even if Iran benefits, they would be willing to let those ships go through, to one of a total blockade. Now, immediately after Trump announced that, the Pentagon vetoed that idea, and which kind of gives you an idea of the power of the national security establishment. And the Pentagon said, no, that's not going to be the policy of the U.S. government. The policy of the U.S. government will be that we're only going to blockade Iranian-related ships that are containing oil. Or if anyone has paid a toll to Iran, we're going to blockade that. But all independent ships that have nothing to do with Iran, that are just simply traveling through the Strait of Hormuz, we're not going to blockade them. Well, of course, as it turns out, though, it's a total blockade, because Iran's not going to let those independent ships come through. They want to charge a toll. And of course, Iran wants to transport its own oil as it was doing before. And so that's what's being blockaded by the U.S. government. So essentially, the U.S. and Iran are working together. I mean, not, like in a formal agreement, but together their efforts are ensuring that no oil at all. And I think this change of policy reflects the confusion surrounding this war. Is, should we do this? Should we not do this? Because there was a time where President Trump was saying, well, maybe we should just invade that land in Iran near the Strait of Hormuz. Do you remember that? All the talk about, okay, well, ground troops would be necessary, and what would be the cost, and how difficult would it be? And, well, the reason they were talking about invading there and controlling the land adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz was because they believed that this was going to be a disaster for the world, including the U.S., if no oil was permitted to go through there without Iranian consent. In other words, if the troops took over that area, U.S. troops, that then there'd be free transit of oil, just like there had been before. And so, again, the blockade says, no, we're not going to do that. And so you get this sense that they didn't really plan out all the contingencies, that Trump went into this war, which on his own initiative, of course, in conjunction, in partnership with Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government. But there was no consultation with anybody. There certainly was no declaration of war, which is what the Constitution requires. Remember, the Constitution's the higher law of the land that we, the people, impose on them, federal officials. They're expected, they're required, this is part of our system, they're required to obey our law, the higher law. They make us obey their laws. Look at their silly, ridiculous drug war. They say you have to obey our drug laws no matter how ridiculous and no matter how much of a racket it is. And if you don't, we're going to punish you. But the same principle applies to the Constitution. They're supposed to obey our law, but they don't do that. The Constitution clearly says you, Mr. President, cannot wage war without a declaration of war from Congress. They don't have a declaration of war from Congress. So the whole war is illegal and unconstitutional from our standpoint, the standpoint of our system of government. Not to mention the fact that it violates the principles set forth at Nuremberg against wars of aggression. But sometimes the president will consult with Congress before he's going to do this or advise Congress. President Trump just went into this thing and with an attack. And it was the second surprise attack in the midst of negotiations. And they end up, assassinating all these Iranian leaders. And I think the reason that Trump did this unilaterally, I think there are various reasons. We can all speculate. It's hard to determine really what motivated him. I think part of it is Epstein. I don't think there's any doubt. I don't have any doubts. In my opinion, Epstein was Mossad, CIA, U.S. Israeli intelligence, and that people are getting closer and closer to figuring that out. But to me, there's no other logical explanation for the sweetheart deal that he got, a pedophile. I mean, that, as I've said before, that sweetheart deal is the most sweetheart deal I've ever seen in the area of federal criminal jurisprudence. There's only one way to explain it, in my opinion, and that is that intelligence, whether Israeli intelligence or American intelligence, but most likely Israeli intelligence applying pressure on U.S. intelligence to get those charges dismissed and give him the sweetheart deal. And so he was never convicted under federal law, and he got this sweetheart state conviction where, in the county jail for a year, where he didn't have to spend time in the jail. He just had to, during the day, he could just sleep there. I mean, that's an incredible deal where a prisoner gets to leave every day and then return to sleep there. And this is for a guy there's no question that he was involved in pedophilia. I mean, we all know that those are not sympathetic characters, either in the federal system or the state system. And so I think this war was designed to distract attention. I mean, this is what the Romans used to do back during the days of the Roman Empire. Whenever there was a rebellion afoot among the Roman people over high taxes, out of control spending, inflation, and so forth, they would just start a war with some foreign enemy, and then everybody gets excited, rally around the flag, and that's clearly what Venezuela was intended to do, because the Venezuelan crisis, it just pops up out of nowhere. All these Navy vessels are suddenly there in the Caribbean, and everybody starts talking about Venezuela, and then there's the attack, and there's the killing of all those people, murder really of those drug war people, and it was all designed to create this conflict, this war, this crisis. But it didn't work. I mean, people were kind of like nonchalant, and Epstein continued to be on the front pages. But one of the problems with the so-called success of the Venezuelan operation, and of course the mainstream press, especially conservative mainstream press, is saying, oh, this was a tremendous success. I don't consider it a success at all. When you're over there partnering with a communist socialist regime, narco-terrorist regime, that to me is not a success. But in any event, imbued with what they consider success, I think Trump figured this was going to be a little cakewalk. And he even said it'll be over in 3 or 4 weeks. And it was. I mean, it was over, very quickly militarily, smashing their Navy and smashing their Army and smashing their Air Force. Well, I don't know how much of the Army they smashed. If the Iranians were smart, they would have just had all the soldiers remain at home. Even though they were bombing homes, the homes were not the principal targets. And so I think much of the Army may have survived the military attacks. But I think Trump, in the wake of Venezuela, said, this is going to be a cakewalk. And Netanyahu, I think, seduced him into thinking that. Hey, come on, we can go and get there. You'll be a hero. We'll get regime change there immediately. And encourage the dissidents to rise up. They'll take control. This will be a pro-U.S. dictatorship that takes over. People will live happily ever after. Well, that's not what happened. And so it's like I've said before, it's become a tar baby. Trump even said, look, we won. We won the war. I'm coming home. I mean, that's the natural thing after you won a war. Bring the troops home. But here, Trump was saying, we won. And he's sending more troops into that area. Like, what? That's the first time I've ever seen where you win a war and there's more troops flooding in the area instead of troops coming home and being discharged, which is normally what happens after a war. And so it all revolves around this Strait of Hormuz problem. And so now they've got this total blockade. Apparently they're not concerned anymore about what they were concerned with at the very beginning when Iran was closing the Strait of Hormuz or controlling it, about the limited amount of oil in the world. And there's no question but that this no oil being furnished through there is causing tremendous economic disruptions. We've seen the price of gasoline over here. There's farmers that are looking at the possibility of bankruptcy, American farmers, because the cost of fertilizer has soared. And a while back I read that the cost of raspberries is soaring because of this. I don't know what the relationship is there. But I read an article that in Asia, they're having tremendous economic disruptions there because of what's happening. And so the real question is if this goes on and there's no peace treaty in these negotiations, and if Trump follows through with another bombing campaign against Iran, which I think will even solidify them even more on this blockade, and I think the U.S. is set with its blockade, will those economic disruptions become extremely severe? And will they extend even more into the United States? People seem to think, oh no, we're immune from anything big, like a big depression or anything over here. That we're resilient, we've got a powerful economy, and I'm not so sure about that, because when you add the tariffs, the enormous tariffs, to what's going on with this oil problem, together with the war on immigrants, you see, that's been kind of shunted aside here. But if you look in Texas, for example, there's restaurants that are faced with closure, bankruptcy, because they can't get enough workers, because the illegal immigrants are not there working for them anymore, and their customer base is diminishing. You just Google any article, restaurants, immigrants, Texas, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Also, the construction industry, like in South Texas, is desperate because they don't have enough workers. So when you add these three things up, the enormous economic disruptions from the oil, which I think are just beginning and beginning to be extended to the United States, to the tremendous economic damage that the tariffs have caused, to the tremendous economic destruction that the war on immigrants, illegal immigrants, and immigrants as well, has caused, I think we're looking at some very possible severe economic problems here. And if they do manifest themselves, the likelihood is that the Federal Reserve is going to respond to these kind of disruptions by granting Trump what he wants, especially after he gets his man in as chairman of the Federal Reserve. They're going to start lowering interest rates. They're going to have quantitative easing, and they're going to be inflating the money supply as a quick jolt into the system, which they always do, especially given that the midterms are coming up. I mean, Trump's thinking that his man gets in there. In my opinion, this is what he's thinking. He gets his man in there in May, and then he orchestrates a lowering of interest rates. You got this artificial jolt of monetary easing into the economy. Politicians have been doing it ever since the Federal Reserve was established. And it appears, prosperity, but it's disguising what's really going on. And that when it finally manifests itself, the reality, which may be after the midterms, but who cares about that at that point? The elections have already been held. But then I think you might see the massive economic disruptions from these three phenomenon together with an inflationary problem. Yeah, because of the Federal Reserve's willingness to serve Trump by giving an artificial, fake jolt of monetary stimulus into the economy just to get the system past the midterms. So time will tell, but as I've said before, it's time for the American people to do some serious soul searching. I mean, what motivated Trump to do this? Oh, he brings up WMDs. Oh, we got to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. And like, this WMD nuclear weapon thing is the tried and true way that caused Americans to support any intervention. I'm surprised they didn't use it in Venezuela. But they used it in Iraq, as y'all recall. Saddam Hussein is coming to get us. They had the charts with all the nuclear bombs and the mushroom clouds, and WMDs. And I remember people telling me, Jacob, they have information, they're privy to information that we just don't have about those WMDs. Well, the inspectors were there. The energy inspectors from the UN and stuff. Oh, no, Jacob, they're incompetent. I had a friend who was part of the national security establishment, the so-called defense industry, and he was telling me, those hapless inspectors are like Clouseau, Inspector Clouseau. They don't know what they're doing, but when the military gets in there, we're going to find those WMDs. Well, the inspectors were saying there's no WMDs. This is all fake and false. And but the military gets in there, and of course they're no different from Inspector Clouseau. They're looking, and where are those WMDs? Where are they? And well, of course they were non-existent. And but it was a lie from the beginning, because the officials know that all they got to do is pull the WMD card, and Americans will go along with anything. And that's what Trump's doing here. Because in my opinion, because even U.S. intelligence, I mean, imagine that, was saying he's not going to be sending a nuclear bomb to the U.S. anytime soon, like in the next 10, 20, 30 years or something. There was never any threat that Iran was going to attack the United States. And think about this also, why would Iran want a nuclear weapon? Well, it seems to me it's logical. The U.S. isn't doing anything about North Korea. Remember, in Trump's first term, he says, I'm going to disarm North Korea. I'm going to make sure they don't have nuclear weapons and stuff. Well, what happened to that official enemy? We haven't heard anything about that official enemy in the second Trump administration. Why? Because they have nuclear weapons. You think Iran and other countries around the world don't recognize this? That the U.S. only attacks countries, recalcitrant countries. They're not going to attack members of their empire like Saudi Arabia or something, like, no matter how tyrannical Saudi Arabia is. It's just as tyrannical as the Iran Ayatollah system. But the U.S. isn't going to attack Saudi Arabia because it's part of the U.S. empire. But they're not going to attack North Korea because it's got nuclear weapons. And so if somebody wants to be independent, they're there thinking, hey, the only way to do this is by acquiring a nuclear weapon. And so the irony is, the dark irony is, that U.S. interventionism gives nations around the world the incentive to get nuclear weapons. So people need to do some real soul searching as to where we are as a country, how we got here, how we get out of it. Just to attack each separate intervention is just, it's endless. I mean, look, 20 years intervention in Afghanistan, and yet no soul searching, no reflection. Well, people didn't even have a time to do any soul searching. NATO goes right on in, which is controlled by the Pentagon, right on in and violates the words of the diplomats, vetoed the agreements of the diplomats, U.S. diplomats, to not extend eastward, which also reflects the control that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA have over this whole process, and starts approaching, over a period of time, Russia's borders, despite the fact that Russia told them, stop doing this, stop doing this. It's the same thing that if Russia was over here helping Venezuela, or Mexico, or establishing military bases there, and darn well the U.S. national security establishment and Trump would never permit such a thing. Well, the Russians feel the same way about the U.S. over there, and of course, statists over here will say, "Oh, they don't have anything to fear from the U.S. government." Are you kidding me? Martin Luther King pointed out this is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, much greater purveyor of violence than North Korea, Russia, China, Cuba, or any totalitarian or communist nation. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world, our government. And I wouldn't want this government, if I were in another government, if I were in the Russian society, I wouldn't want the greatest purveyor of violence on my border. And then don't forget that Germany is part of NATO. Do you think they want German troops on Russia's border? I mean, you can say Russia's paranoid. Well, yeah, maybe so, but they have reason to be paranoid. Even paranoid people are followed from time to time. And Germany devastated, almost destroyed, almost conquered Russia in the Second World War. Killed mass numbers of people, destroyed their entire industrial base and so forth. But NATO knew that. The Pentagon knew that as they were approaching more and more. And so they provoke this new crisis before people had a chance to reflect and digest what had happened in Afghanistan. 20 years of death and destruction. For what? And then look at Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom. I always love that one. Not one single American I've ever heard of goes to Iraq on vacation, summer vacation. Never. And walks around, this is a freedom in Iraq, freedom in Iraq. Not even members of Congress go to Iraq on vacation. Well, that should tell you something. It's just a disaster. And so what Americans need to do is some soul searching where they question the whole paradigm of foreign interventionism. And equally important, the whole system of a national security state. You know, the national security state became part of our governmental system without a constitutional amendment because of the Cold War fear and the anti-communist crusade. It was all a big racket, just like the war on terrorism's a racket. And but people bought into it. The Russians are coming. They're going to enslave us. They're going to teach communism in the public schools and so forth. All the while, America's moving in a socialist direction with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public schooling, immigration controls, the Federal Reserve, and any number of other socialist interventionist programs. But it was all just a great big racket that caused Americans to abandon our founding governmental system of a limited government republic. And that's what we need to do. We need to restore that limited government republic. And that's where the soul searching comes in, is that this is a horrific type of governmental system. It's a totalitarian type of governmental system. Violence, the greatest purveyor of violence. And at the center of this violence is the national security state form of governmental structure. Assassinations, torture, indefinite detention, the starting wars of aggression, attacking countries that were never going to attack the United States. Iran was never going to attack the United States. And so people say, well, yeah, but they were supporting Hamas and they were supporting Hezbollah. Okay. And so what does that have to do with the United States? You know, that's a problem for the Israeli government. That's not a problem for the United States. And so this notion that the U.S. government needs to be a poodle to the Israeli government and obey the commands of the Israeli government and do whatever they say is just outrageous. I mean, this is what George Washington was talking about when he said no entangling alliances. You know, that we have a special ability here to stay out of all these European conflicts and the Asian conflicts and so forth, and preferably stay out of the Latin American conflicts as well. Then if people want to help out Israel, they can travel over there and fight and join the Israeli armed forces or send money or whatever. Keep the government out of it. That's what John Quincy Adams' famous speech, In Search of Monsters to Destroy, was all about. And I'm addressing this whole situation in my new series, The Evil Within, which I would invite you all to watch. It's a video series on the evil systems that have attached themselves to the federal government. They were no part of our governmental system for more than 100 years. They became attached there like cancerous tumors. Let me mention a little bit about Venezuela. Remember when Maria Corina Machado, the leader of the dissident movement of Venezuela, said she was going to go back to Venezuela? And I said, I don't think so. And I predicted she would not go. Well, that prediction turned out to be true. She has not returned to Venezuela. And in my opinion, she's smart not to. I think they'd kill her. I think they'd kill her real fast. Well, they clearly jailed her and arrest her because they've already said they're going to do that. Now, this is the regime that the U.S. government has partnered with. Remember, for decades, they had sanctions on this regime, which caused economic strangulation in combination with Venezuela's socialist system that caused 8 million Venezuelans to flee for their lives. And many of whom, as we all know, came to the United States where they were treated like horse dung. Oh, invaders, Jacob, invaders. Oh, they got tattoos, Jacob. No, oh my gosh, Jacob, send them to El Salvador where they can be imprisoned for the rest of their lives and tortured even though they've never been convicted of anything. Or return them to Venezuela where they can die under those economic conditions. All the while strengthening the sanctions that were creating even more death by starvation and chaos and so forth. So, yet, after the kidnapping of Maduro, they partner with this communist socialist regime. Now, Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, she's been replacing people that were loyal to Maduro to bring people that are loyal to her. But the same system applies. She is not some born-again capitalist or born-again libertarian, I'll guarantee you that. She's biding her time and obeying orders from Trump, as Maria Corina Machado has pointed out. She's obeying orders because if she doesn't, Trump simply returns to strangling the Venezuelan people by this full embargo, and which is what caused her to surrender in the first place. But the moral repugnancy of partnering, maintaining, strengthening a Freudian slip, a Venezuelan communist, socialist, narco-terrorist regime is incredible. I mean, to me, and the fact that it's all normalized is amazing. So Machado does not return to Venezuela after all. And this is what I said she should not do. She wanted Trump's blessing and Trump's approval, and I think that Trump told her, don't go back. I can't keep you safe from the regime that I'm protecting now. You don't have any respect among your people. And my opinion was that he told her this would not be a smart move. And it would not be a smart move. I have no doubts they'd kill her immediately. And so she's not going back. But it kind of gives you an idea that this is not exactly a free country. They still have all these political prisoners there. They've released a few for for the sake of show, so they could, Trump could say, oh, they've released political prisoners. Oh, there's an amnesty law and so forth. It's all a sham, because a lot of those political prisoners are still there, and the system is still there. That's the thing. The narco-terrorist Cuban-like, Freudian slip again there, socialist communist system is still in play. Finally, let me make a point about these off-kilter killings that are taking place. You've got a whole spate of these things, and they're sort of ongoing. There was this guy in New York that he was a little weird, but all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, takes a machete and starts chopping up people in the subway system there in New York City. They killed him, and then he was a panhandler in a robe. There's the guy that in Louisiana, that 31-year-old guy just killed 8 children, seven of whom were his children. The former lieutenant governor of Virginia, Justin Fairfax, he kills his wife, murders her, and then commits suicide. And there's a lot of these mass killings that take place in families, but they don't get all the publicity they do when there's mass killing out there in the public, like some public school or something. But I've always said that there's a reason for this. This is what people do not want to confront. I can't prove it. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I have no doubts that it's true that when you have a society whose government is wreaking death and destruction all over the world, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, we can convince ourselves that this will have no effect on American society because American troops are not losing their lives in large numbers. People are not attacking the United States. Okay, there's some gasoline prices rising, but there's no death and destruction here. And so the idea has always been that we can be immune from this death machine that the U.S. has become, this killing machine. My position is no. That those deaths, massive deaths all over the world, including Iran right now, will somehow seep into the pores and the conscience and the subconscious, the conscious mentality of the American people. And that the off-kilter, now most people can handle it, okay? They can get upset, they can have a protest, whatever. But then there's the off-kilter people. And that's what's triggering these off-kilter people. And you can see the studies, you can Google mass killings U.S. and see that it really is a problem that the U.S. faces, these mass killings year after year after year. And large numbers, especially in families and so forth. I have no doubts that what's happening is that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, killing all these people around the world, millions, over a long period of time, during our lifetime, millions upon millions, that's what's triggering the off-kilter people to go do their off-killing. It's essentially like a subconscious copycat killing. But there is no doubt in my mind that when you have a government that's wreaking death and destruction across the world, even though Americans are not getting killed in large numbers, it's going to have an effect here at home, among everybody, but especially among the off-kilter people. That's Trump Watch for this week. Thank you all for tuning in. And as always, thank you for your great support of the Future of Freedom Foundation.